Jessica Martinez glanced at the digital clock mounted above the teller windows at Wells Fargo Bank in the Kendall neighborhood of Miami, Florida. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, and the bank was moderately busy with the usual mix of customers conducting their banking business, depositing checks, withdrawing cash, opening accounts, asking questions about mortgages and loans. Jessica had been working as a bank teller at this branch for 8 years, processing thousands of transactions weekly, interacting with hundreds of customers, becoming intimately familiar with the rhythms of retail banking and the patterns of customer behavior. At 33 years old, Jessica had started at Wells Fargo when she was 25, taking the teller position after completing an associate degree in business administration at Miami-Dade College. She'd initially viewed the job as temporary, something to pay the bills while she figured out her long-term career path. But 8 years later, she was still at the bank, having been promoted to senior teller and then lead teller, supervising 3 other tellers and handling complex transactions. The work paid reasonably well. Jessica made approximately $38,000 annually, plus benefits, and provided stability that was valuable as a single mother raising a 9-year-old daughter. The job had become routine over 8 years. Jessica could process most transactions almost automatically: deposits, withdrawals, transfers, check cashing, account inquiries. She knew the regular customers by name, recognized their patterns, could predict what they'd need before they asked. She understood the bank's policies and procedures thoroughly, knew how to handle unusual situations, maintained accuracy in her cash drawer, and provided friendly, efficient service that kept customers satisfied and management happy. But the routine nature of the work also meant Jessica had developed sharp observational skills. After 8 years of watching thousands of customers conduct banking transactions, she'd learned to notice when something seemed off, when a customer's behavior suggested they might be under duress, when a transaction didn't match the customer's typical patterns, when someone appeared confused or frightened or coerced. These observations had occasionally led Jessica to flag potentially problematic transactions, suspected fraud, possible identity theft, customers who seemed to be withdrawing money under duress from abusive partners or family members. Wells Fargo, like all major banks, had extensive training for employees on recognizing and reporting financial exploitation, particularly of vulnerable populations like elderly customers. Banks were on the front lines of detecting elder financial abuse, the illegal or improper use of an elderly person's funds, property or assets by family members, caregivers or strangers. Elder financial abuse was estimated to cost victims more than $36 billion annually in the United States, with only a small fraction of cases being reported or prosecuted. Jessica had completed multiple training sessions on recognizing red flags of elder financial abuse: elderly customers making unusual large withdrawals or transfers, customers appearing confused or uncertain about transactions, customers accompanied by someone who seemed to be controlling or intimidating them, customers with unexplained injuries suggesting physical abuse, sudden changes in banking patterns for long-time customers, customers who seemed fearful or anxious about banking decisions. The training emphasized that bank employees weren't expected to investigate or confront suspected abusers, but rather to document observations and report concerns to management, who would escalate to the bank's fraud prevention team and potentially to law enforcement or adult protective services. The goal was to provide a safety net for vulnerable customers who might be too frightened or confused to report exploitation themselves. Jessica had reported concerns about potential elder abuse 3 times over her 8 years at the bank. One case had been investigated and determined to be a legitimate transaction with no exploitation involved, an elderly customer making large withdrawals to pay for home renovations. Another case had led to investigation that confirmed financial exploitation by a caregiver, resulting in the caregiver's arrest and the elderly victim being connected with protective services. The third case was still under investigation by Adult Protective Services when Jessica last heard about it. These experiences had taught Jessica that her observations and willingness to report concerns could make genuine differences in protecting vulnerable customers. She'd also learned that financial exploitation often occurred within families, adult children or grandchildren exploiting elderly parents or grandparents, taking advantage of their trust and authority as family members to steal money or property. These cases were particularly heartbreaking because victims often refused to report the abuse, either because they didn't recognize it as exploitation because they were embarrassed, or because they loved their abusers despite the harm being done. As Jessica served the next customer in line, a middle-aged man depositing a paycheck, she noticed an elderly woman enter the bank and take a number from the queue system. The woman appeared to be in her late 70s, with white hair styled neatly, wearing slacks and a cardigan sweater that suggested she took pride in her appearance. She walked slowly but steadily to the waiting area and sat down, holding a worn leather purse in her lap with both hands. Jessica processed several more customers over the next 10 minutes, her attention divided between serving people at her window and the general flow of activity in the bank. She noticed that the elderly woman remained seated in the waiting area, her number not yet called, her posture rigid with tension that seemed unusual for someone simply waiting to conduct routine banking. When the elderly woman's number was finally called to Jessica's window, the woman stood and walked over slowly, her movements stiff with age or anxiety or both. Up close, Jessica could see that the woman had kind eyes that were currently filled with worry, and that her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her purse. "Good afternoon, how can I help you today?" Jessica asked with her practiced professional friendliness, smiling warmly to put the customer at ease. "Hello, dear. I need to withdraw some money from my savings account." The woman's voice was soft and cultured, with a slight southern accent that suggested she'd grown up somewhere in the deep south before relocating to Florida, as many retirees did. "Of course I can help you with that. May I have your account number or ID, please?" The woman fumbled in her purse and pulled out her driver's license with hands that shook noticeably. Jessica took the license and saw the name, Margaret Henderson, age 78, address in a nearby residential neighborhood. Jessica pulled up Margaret's account information on her computer screen and saw that Margaret had been a customer for approximately 12 years, maintaining a checking account and a savings account with relatively modest balances. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. How much would you like to withdraw today?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes darting toward the bank entrance as if checking to see if someone was watching. "I need to withdraw $20,000 from my savings account, in cash." Jessica's internal alarm bells immediately activated. $20,000 was an unusually large cash withdrawal, particularly for an elderly customer, whose accounts showed she lived on a fixed income. Jessica glanced at the account balance on her screen and saw that Margaret's savings account contained approximately $23,000, meaning this withdrawal would represent nearly her entire life savings. $20,000 in cash, Jessica repeated carefully, watching Margaret's face for reactions. "That's certainly possible, though it's a significant amount. May I ask what you need the cash for?" Sometimes there are safer alternatives like cashier's checks or wire transfers for large payments. Margaret's hands tightened on her purse. "I just need it in cash. My grandson needs it. It's a family matter." Her voice was strained, and Jessica noticed that Margaret's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Jessica's concern intensified. An elderly customer withdrawing her life savings in cash to give to a grandson was a classic red flag for financial exploitation. Jessica needed to proceed carefully. She couldn't refuse the withdrawal without cause, but she also needed to assess whether Margaret was being coerced or exploited. "I understand. It's your money, of course, and I can process the withdrawal for you. But because it's such a large amount, I need to ask a few standard security questions, just to make sure everything is okay. Is that all right?" Margaret nodded, looking increasingly anxious. "Are you making this withdrawal of your own free will, or is anyone pressuring you to withdraw this money?" It's my decision." Margaret's response was hesitant, unconvincing. "Has anyone threatened you or said they'll hurt you if you don't give them money?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her cheeks. Her whole body was trembling now. "I just need to withdraw the money. Please, he's waiting outside." Jessica felt her heart sink. Margaret's response and demeanor strongly suggested she was being coerced into withdrawing the money, likely by the grandson she'd mentioned. The fact that he's waiting outside indicated that someone was actively monitoring this transaction, applying pressure, ensuring Margaret complied with demands for money. Jessica made a decision. "Mrs. Henderson, I can see you're upset. I want to help you. But I'm concerned that someone might be taking advantage of you or pressuring you to give them money you don't want to give. Can you tell me what's happening? Whatever you say will be kept confidential, and we can help you if someone is threatening you." Margaret broke down completely, sobbing quietly, her shoulders shaking. "My grandson Tyler needs money. He says he's in trouble, says he owes people money, and they'll hurt him if he doesn't pay. He came to my house yesterday, and he was so angry. He grabbed my wrists and twisted them until I cried and said I'd give him money. He told me I had to come to the bank today and withdraw $20,000 and give it to him. He's outside right now waiting. If I don't bring him the money, he said he'll come back tonight and hurt me worse. Please, I just need the money so he'll leave me alone." Jessica's blood ran cold. This wasn't financial exploitation in some abstract sense. This was active, ongoing abuse. Margaret was being physically assaulted and extorted by her grandson, threatened with more violence if she didn't comply with his demands, terrified of what would happen if she didn't give him her life savings. Mrs. Henderson, what you're describing is elder abuse. Your grandson is committing crimes, assault, extortion, financial exploitation. You don't have to give him this money. We can help protect you. Can I please call our security officer and have them contact police? You're not safe, and we can get you help. Margaret looked panicked. No police. Tyler will be so angry. He'll hurt me worse. I just need to give him the money, and then maybe he'll leave me alone. But Mrs. Henderson, if you give him $20,000 today, what happens when he wants more money tomorrow or next week? Abusers don't stop when you give them what they want. They escalate. They keep demanding more. You'll have given him your life savings, and you'll still be in danger. Margaret sobbed harder. I don't know what to do. I'm so scared, but I can't call the police. Tyler is my grandson, my daughter's son. If I call the police on him, my daughter will never forgive me, and Tyler knows where I live. Even if police arrest him, they'll let him out eventually, and he'll come back and hurt me. Jessica understood Margaret's fear and the complicated dynamics that made elder abuse within families so difficult to address. Victims loved their abusers, felt loyalty to family members, feared retaliation, worried about causing family conflicts, felt ashamed of being abused, and often believed they had no choice but to comply with demands. But Jessica also knew that if she processed this withdrawal, she'd be enabling the abuse to continue. Margaret would be left with almost nothing in savings. Tyler would likely demand more money in the future, and the cycle of abuse would continue until either Margaret was completely drained financially or suffered serious physical harm. Jessica made another decision. Mrs. Henderson, I need to speak with my manager about this transaction. I'm going to step away for just a moment, but I promise you, we're going to figure out how to help you. Please wait right here. Jessica walked quickly to the branch manager's office at the back of the bank. The manager, David Park, was a man in his mid-40s who'd been with Wells Fargo for 15 years and had dealt with numerous cases of suspected financial exploitation. Jessica knocked on his partially open door. David, I need you immediately. I have an elderly customer at my window who's being extorted by her grandson. She's trying to withdraw $20,000, essentially her life savings, because he physically assaulted her and threatened to hurt her worse if she doesn't give him the money. He's apparently waiting outside the bank right now. This is an active abuse situation, and we need to involve police. David's expression became immediately serious. Is the customer willing to talk to police? She's terrified of retaliation. She doesn't want to involve law enforcement because she's afraid her grandson will hurt her worse. But she's clearly being coerced, and she's shown me bruises on her wrists where he grabbed her. This isn't a situation where she's voluntarily giving money to a family member. She's being violently extorted. David stood. I'm calling police immediately. We're going to stall the transaction and get officers here. Where is the customer now? At my window. The grandson is supposedly outside watching. Okay, I need you to go back to your window and tell the customer that for security reasons, a withdrawal of that size requires manager approval and some additional paperwork, and it's going to take about 30 minutes to process. That will buy us time for police to arrive. Tell her you're getting the paperwork started. Keep her calm. Keep her at your window. I'm calling 911 right now. Jessica returned to her teller window where Margaret was still standing, looking increasingly anxious. Mrs. Henderson, thank you for waiting. For a withdrawal of $20,000, bank policy requires manager approval and some additional security paperwork. It's going to take about 30 minutes to process everything. Is that okay? I know it's an inconvenience, but it's for the security of your account. Margaret looked distressed. 30 minutes. Tyler is waiting. He's going to be angry that it's taking so long. I understand, but it's bank policy for large withdrawals. There's nothing I can do to speed up the process. Would you like to sit in the waiting area while I prepare the paperwork? You'll be more comfortable there. No, I'll stay here. I need to make sure this gets done. Margaret's agitation was increasing. Jessica worried that if Tyler came into the bank to check on why things were taking so long, the situation could become volatile. Jessica pretended to fill out forms on her computer while maintaining conversation with Margaret to keep her calm and distracted. Have you lived in Miami long, Mrs. Henderson? About 15 years. My husband and I moved here from Georgia when he retired. He passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss. Do you have other family in the area besides your grandson? My daughter lives in Fort Lauderdale. That's Tyler's mother, but I don't see her much anymore. She's very busy.
The sadness in Margaret's voice suggested the relationship with her daughter had deteriorated, possibly related to Tyler's behavior. Jessica kept Margaret talking, asking gentle questions about her life, her late husband, her home, anything to pass time while police were being called. After about 10 minutes, Margaret began to get more agitated. "This is taking so long. I need to tell Tyler it's going to be a while. He's going to be so upset. Please don't go outside, Mrs. Henderson. I'm almost done with the paperwork. If Tyler is concerned, he can come inside and wait in the lobby. The bank is a safe place." But Margaret shook her head. "No, he can't come in. He might cause a scene. He gets very angry. I need to go tell him it's taking longer than expected." Before Jessica could stop her, Margaret turned and walked toward the bank entrance. Jessica immediately signaled to David Park, who was standing near the manager's office talking on his phone, presumably with 911. "Ambulpeditst phone trid ripple to encode de mes pli entrits pli so the eng but backstand." David saw Margaret leaving and moved to intercept her, but Margaret was already pushing through the door and exiting the bank. Jessica watched through the large windows at the front of the bank as Margaret approached a young man standing near a car in the parking lot. The man appeared to be in his mid-20s, with an athletic build, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. As Margaret approached him, she appeared to be explaining something, gesturing back toward the bank. The young man's body language became immediately aggressive. He stepped toward Margaret, grabbed her arm roughly, and appeared to be yelling at her, his face contorted with anger. Jessica grabbed the phone at her telestation and called David. "The grandson is in the parking lot, and he's grabbed Margaret. He's being physically aggressive with her right now." David, who'd also been watching through the window, responded, "Police are 2 minutes away. I'm going outside with security. Don't follow me. Stay inside where it's safe." David and the bank's security guard exited through the main entrance and walked quickly toward the parking lot. Jessica watched as they approached Tyler and Margaret. Tyler immediately released Margaret's arm and took a step back, clearly not wanting to be physically aggressive in front of witnesses. David appeared to be speaking to Tyler calmly, while the security guard positioned himself between Tyler and Margaret. Within 2 minutes, 2 Miami-Dade Police Department patrol cars pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. Officers emerged from both vehicles and approached the group. Tyler immediately became defensive, raising his hands and backing away from Margaret as officers approached. One officer spoke with David and the security guard, while another officer spoke separately with Tyler, and a third officer gently led Margaret away from both groups to take her statement. The situation in the parking lot continued for approximately 30 minutes. Jessica watched from inside the bank, along with other employees and customers who'd become aware of the unfolding drama. Eventually, officers handcuffed Tyler and placed him in the back of one of the patrol cars. Margaret was led to the other patrol car, not in custody but apparently being taken somewhere for her safety. David Park returned to the bank and came to Jessica's teller window. "Tyler Henderson has been arrested for elder abuse, assault, and attempted extortion. Mrs. Henderson is being taken to the police station to give a full statement, and then officers will help connect her with Adult Protective Services to ensure she has safe housing and support. She's not going back to her home tonight because Tyler knows where she lives, and there's concern he might have associates who could target her for retaliation. The investigating detective wants to speak with you about what Mrs. Henderson told you and what you observed. Are you willing to give a statement?" "Absolutely," Jessica said. "Is Mrs. Henderson okay? Is she safe? She's scared but unharmed beyond the bruises on her wrists from yesterday. Thanks to your observation and your questioning, we intervened before she withdrew her life savings and handed it over to her abuser. You very likely saved her from being completely drained financially and possibly suffering worse physical abuse." Jessica felt a wave of relief mixed with residual anxiety about the situation. She'd seen Margaret's terror, understood how frightened the elderly woman had been of her grandson's retaliation, and felt grateful that police had arrived before Margaret was forced to hand over the money that would have left her destitute. Over the next several hours, Jessica gave a detailed statement to a detective from the Miami-Dade Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit. Detective Robert Chen was a man in his mid-40s who specialized in investigating financial and physical abuse of elderly victims. Jessica described everything she'd observed. Margaret's shaking hands, her fearful glances toward the entrance, her tears when asked security questions, her admission that Tyler had assaulted her and threatened worse violence if she didn't give him money, the bruises on her wrists, Tyler's aggressive behavior in the parking lot. Your observation and your questioning very likely saved Mrs. Henderson from a devastating situation, Detective Chen told Jessica. Elder financial abuse often involves family members who exploit their relationships and their physical proximity to victims. Elderly people are particularly vulnerable because they may have cognitive decline that makes them easier to manipulate. They may be physically frail and unable to resist demands, and they often feel loyalty and love toward family members even when those family members are abusing them. Detective Chen explained that the case against Tyler Henderson was strong. He'd been arrested with probable cause for assault based on the visible bruises on Margaret's wrists and her statement that Tyler had grabbed and twisted her wrists until she agreed to give him money. He was also being charged with attempted extortion, demanding money through threats of violence. If convicted, Tyler faced up to 15 years in prison on the combined charges. What happens to Mrs. Henderson now? Jessica asked. She was so afraid of going back to her home. She's being placed in temporary protective housing through Adult Protective Services. Detective Chen said. It's a safe location that her grandson doesn't know about. She'll stay there while we investigate, and while she works with a case manager to develop a long-term safety plan. The case manager will help her get a restraining order against Tyler, will assess whether she needs to relocate permanently for her safety, will connect her with financial counseling to protect her remaining assets, and will provide support services to help her recover from the trauma of being abused by a family member. Detective Chen added that investigators would be examining Tyler's background and financial records to determine if he'd exploited other elderly people or if Margaret was his only victim. They'd also be looking into his claim that he owed people money, whether that was legitimate debt or whether it was related to criminal activity like gambling or drugs. Over the following weeks, the investigation revealed disturbing details about Tyler Henderson's exploitation of his grandmother. Tyler was 24 years old, unemployed, and had a significant gambling addiction. He'd accumulated approximately $30,000 in gambling debts to illegal bookmakers who were threatening violence if he didn't pay. Rather than facing the consequences of his addiction or seeking help, Tyler had decided to extort money from his elderly grandmother, knowing she had savings and knowing she'd be vulnerable to threats and physical intimidation. The assault on Margaret, where Tyler twisted her wrists, wasn't the first time he'd been physically aggressive with her. Investigation revealed that over the past 6 months, Tyler had been regularly visiting Margaret's home, asking for money for various supposed emergencies, becoming angry and verbally abusive when she refused or said she didn't have money to give. The demands had escalated from hundreds of dollars to thousands, and when Margaret finally refused a demand for $5,000, Tyler had assaulted her and threatened worse violence unless she withdrew a large sum from her bank account. Margaret had been too frightened and ashamed to report the abuse to anyone. She loved Tyler despite his behavior. He was her grandson, her daughter's son, someone she'd watched grow up and had hoped would turn his life around. She felt guilty about the prospect of getting him in trouble with law enforcement. She worried about how her daughter would react if she reported Tyler's abuse. And she genuinely feared retaliation if Tyler found out she'd gone to police. These complex emotions and fears were typical of elder abuse victims, particularly when the abuser was a family member. The bonds of family, the desire to protect loved ones even when they caused harm, the shame of admitting that a family member was abusive, and the fear of retaliation all contributed to underreporting of elder abuse. Experts estimated that for every case of elder abuse reported, approximately 24 cases went unreported, meaning the problem was far larger than official statistics suggested. Margaret's case also revealed that her daughter, Tyler's mother, Linda Henderson, had been aware of Tyler's behavior, but had minimized and enabled it. When investigators contacted Linda to inform her of Tyler's arrest, her initial reaction was to defend him and express anger that Margaret had gotten Tyler in trouble with the police. Linda insisted that Tyler was just going through a hard time and that Margaret should have given him the money he needed, rather than involving authorities. This reaction was unfortunately common in families dealing with elder abuse. Other family members often sided with the abuser, blamed the victim, or pressured the victim to drop charges or recant statements. The dynamics made it difficult for elderly victims to get support from their families and reinforced their isolation and vulnerability. But investigators and Adult Protective Services workers were experienced in navigating these complex family dynamics. They worked with Margaret to help her understand that Tyler's behavior was abusive and criminal, that she wasn't responsible for his gambling addiction or his debts, that giving him money wouldn't solve his problems and would only enable his harmful behavior, and that she deserved to be safe and to keep the money she'd saved through years of work and careful budgeting. Margaret spent 3 weeks in protective housing while investigators built their case against Tyler, and while she worked with a case manager to develop a safety plan. The case manager helped Margaret obtain a restraining order, prohibiting Tyler from contacting her or coming within 500 feet of her residence. They helped her change her phone number and set up security measures at her home, including a new lock system and a personal emergency response device that would alert authorities if she pressed a panic button. Most difficult for Margaret was the decision about whether to testify against Tyler at trial. Prosecutors explained that her testimony would be crucial for securing a conviction on the most serious charges. But testifying meant confronting Tyler in court, meant potentially destroying her relationship with her daughter Linda, meant publicly acknowledging the abuse, and meant accepting that her grandson would likely spend years in prison.
Margaret struggled with the decision, working through it with a therapist who specialized in elder abuse trauma. Eventually, she decided to testify. "I love Tyler," Margaret told Detective Chen when informing him of her decision, But what he did was wrong. He hurt me. He scared me. He tried to steal my life savings. And if I don't hold him accountable, he'll just do this to someone else. Maybe another elderly person. Maybe his own mother someday when she's older. I don't want Tyler to go to prison, but I also can't enable his behavior by staying silent. So I'll testify. I'll tell the truth about what he did. And I'll hope that somehow this leads to him getting help for his problems. The trial took place 4 months after Tyler's arrest. Jessica was called as a witness to describe Margaret's demeanor when attempting to withdraw the money and to recount what Margaret had told her about Tyler's threats and assault. Jessica's testimony was powerful because she was a neutral third party with no connection to the family, and her detailed observations corroborated Margaret's account of being coerced. Margaret's own testimony was emotional and difficult. She described Tyler's escalating demands for money over 6 months, his verbal abuse when she refused, his physical assault when she finally said no to a large demand, his threats to hurt her worse if she didn't go to the bank and withdraw $20,000. She showed the judge and jury photos of the bruises on her wrists. She explained that she'd felt she had no choice but to comply with Tyler's demands because she was terrified of what he'd do to her if she refused. Tyler's defense attorney tried to argue that Tyler hadn't intended to permanently deprive Margaret of her money, that he'd planned to pay her back once he resolved his financial issues, that his behavior was the result of desperation from his gambling debts rather than malicious intent to harm his grandmother. But prosecutors countered that intent to repay was irrelevant. Tyler had assaulted Margaret, threatened her with violence, and coerced her into attempting to withdraw money through fear and intimidation. Those actions constituted crimes regardless of Tyler's intentions or his gambling problems. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: assault on an elderly person, attempted financial exploitation of an elderly person, and attempted extortion. Tyler was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years if he completed substance abuse and gambling addiction treatment programs while incarcerated. Margaret was in the courtroom when the sentence was read. She cried, not from relief or satisfaction, but from sadness that her grandson's choices had led to this outcome. But she also felt a weight lift. Tyler would be in prison for years, unable to threaten or harm her. She could live in her home without fear. She still had her savings intact, and while her relationship with her daughter Linda remained strained, Margaret had connected with support groups for elder abuse survivors, where she'd found community with others who understood what she'd experienced. Jessica attended the sentencing hearing, having been invited by Detective Chen and the prosecutor who'd appreciated her role in the case. Sitting in the courtroom and hearing the sentence, Jessica felt profound satisfaction, knowing that her observation and her questioning had prevented Margaret from being financially devastated and had led to Tyler being held accountable for his abusive behavior. After the hearing, Margaret approached Jessica in the courthouse hallway. "Thank you," Margaret said, embracing Jessica. "Thank you for noticing I was in trouble. Thank you for asking questions instead of just processing the withdrawal. Thank you for caring about an old woman you didn't know. You saved me that day. You saved my life savings, and you probably saved me from being hurt worse by Tyler. I'll never forget what you did." Jessica hugged Margaret back, feeling emotional. "I'm so glad I was able to help, and I'm glad you had the courage to testify and hold Tyler accountable. That took incredible bravery. I did it because you gave me hope that day that someone cared and that there was help available," Margaret said. "When you stopped the withdrawal and called your manager, when police came, when everyone took my situation seriously instead of dismissing it as a family matter, that showed me I didn't have to just accept being abused. I could fight back. I could protect myself. You started that process." The case generated media coverage in Miami, with local news stations running stories about elder financial abuse and highlighting the role of the alert bank teller who'd recognized the warning signs and intervened. Jessica was interviewed and reluctantly accepted being called a hero, though she insisted she'd simply done what any bank employee should do when recognizing signs of financial exploitation. "I was trained to watch for red flags of elder abuse," Jessica told reporters. "When Mrs. Henderson came to my window wanting to withdraw $20,000 in cash, when I saw her hands shaking and saw her looking fearfully toward the door, when she admitted her grandson had threatened her, those were all classic warning signs. I didn't do anything heroic. I just paid attention to my training and my instincts and reported concerns. The police and adult protective services did the real work of protecting Mrs. Henderson and prosecuting her abuser." But the coverage emphasized that despite training, many bank employees failed to recognize or report elder financial exploitation. Studies showed that financial institutions detected only a small fraction of elder abuse cases, even though banks were uniquely positioned to notice suspicious transactions. The reasons for underreporting included employees not recognizing warning signs, not wanting to get involved in customers' personal affairs, not knowing how to report concerns, or not taking elderly customers' statements seriously. Jessica's case became a training example used by Wells Fargo and other financial institutions to teach employees about recognizing and responding to elder financial exploitation. The training emphasized specific warning signs Jessica had observed: large withdrawals that would deplete savings accounts, elderly customers appearing nervous or fearful, customers with visible injuries, customers mentioning family members who need money, customers accompanied by people who seem controlling, sudden changes in banking patterns for long-time customers. The training also emphasized the importance of asking careful questions when suspicious transactions were requested. Jessica's questions to Margaret: "Are you making this withdrawal of your own free will? Has anyone threatened you? Can you tell me what's happening?" had created an opening for Margaret to disclose the abuse. The training taught employees to ask these questions privately, to listen carefully to responses, to watch for signs of distress, and to report concerns rather than completing transactions that might enable exploitation. Over the next several years, the training based on Jessica's case led to dozens of documented interventions where bank employees recognized potential elder financial abuse and reported it, resulting in investigations that protected vulnerable customers. A teller in Tampa noticed an elderly man being accompanied by his son to make large withdrawals and appearing frightened, reported concerns, and investigation revealed the son had been exploiting his father for 2 years. A teller in Orlando noticed an elderly woman making repeated large cash withdrawals to give to someone claiming to be an IRS agent, recognized it as a scam, and prevented the woman from losing her life savings. A teller in Jacksonville noticed changes in an elderly customer's banking patterns after the customer hired a new caretaker, reported concerns, and investigation revealed the caretaker was stealing from the customer's accounts. Each of these interventions traced back to the training and awareness that Jessica's experience with Margaret Henderson had helped generate. Her decision to pay attention to Margaret's fearful demeanor, to ask probing questions, to refuse to simply process the withdrawal without investigating further, that had created ripples that extended far beyond one elderly woman in Miami. Jessica continued working at Wells Fargo, eventually being promoted to assistant branch manager with responsibilities that went beyond teller duties. She became the branch's specialist in elder financial abuse prevention, training new employees on recognizing warning signs and proper reporting procedures. She also served on a regional task force that Wells Fargo had established to develop better systems for identifying and preventing financial exploitation of vulnerable customers. The task force's work led to implementation of new policies at Wells Fargo branches across Florida. The bank installed financial abuse specialists at larger branches, employees specifically trained to handle situations where elder abuse or financial exploitation was suspected. They created a streamlined reporting system that allowed any employee to flag suspicious transactions for immediate review by specialists and management. They developed relationships with local law enforcement and adult protective services agencies to facilitate rapid response when exploitation was identified. The policies also included protocols for delaying transactions when exploitation was suspected, similar to what Jessica had done with Margaret's withdrawal, giving investigators time to respond before money changed hands. Florida law provided legal protection for financial institutions that delayed or refused transactions based on reasonable suspicion of exploitation, addressing banks' concerns about liability for interfering with customers' access to their own funds. These systemic changes meant that banks became more effective partners in protecting elderly customers from financial exploitation. But Jessica also recognized the limitations of what banks could do. Financial institutions could identify exploitation when it manifested in banking transactions, but much elder abuse occurred without leaving obvious financial footprints. Family members who stole cash or jewelry, caregivers who forged checks in small amounts that didn't trigger alerts, scammers who convinced elderly victims to wire money through channels that bypassed traditional banking. Addressing elder abuse comprehensively required coordination among many systems: financial institutions, law enforcement, adult protective services, healthcare providers, social service agencies, legal aid organizations, and community members who interacted with elderly people. Each system had a role in identifying abuse, protecting victims, holding perpetrators accountable, and providing support for survivors. Jessica became involved in community education efforts about elder abuse, speaking at senior centers, retirement communities, and caregiver training programs about financial exploitation and how to recognize warning signs.
She explained common scams targeting elderly people, IRS impersonation scams, lottery scams, romance scams, grandparent scams, where criminals posed as grandchildren in emergency situations needing money, investment fraud, targeting retirees' savings. She also discussed abuse by family members and caregivers, which was often harder for victims to recognize as abuse because of the trust relationships involved. If a family member is pressuring you to give them money, threatening you if you refuse, taking money from your accounts without permission, or controlling your access to your own finances, that's financial abuse, Jessica would tell audiences. It doesn't matter that they're family. It doesn't matter if they say they'll pay you back. If someone is taking your money through threats, manipulation or deception, that's exploitation, and it's illegal. Jessica emphasized that elderly people had the right to control their own finances, to say no to requests for money from family members, to spend their savings on their own needs, rather than on adult children or grandchildren who should be supporting themselves. She explained resources available for victims, including adult protective services, legal aid for obtaining protective orders, law enforcement for reporting crimes, and support groups for processing the trauma of being exploited by trusted people. The community education sessions revealed how prevalent elder financial abuse was and how many people had experienced it or witnessed it happening to family members or friends. After each presentation, multiple attendees would approach Jessica to share their stories. An elderly mother who'd given thousands of dollars to a son with addiction problems, a father who'd been scammed out of his pension by a fraudulent investment advisor, a neighbor who seemed to be controlled by an adult daughter who'd moved into her home and isolated her from friends. Each story reinforced the importance of awareness, education, and intervention systems that could protect vulnerable elderly people from exploitation. Jessica encouraged people who suspected elder abuse to report it to Adult Protective Services, to law enforcement, to the elderly person's bank or financial advisor. You might be wrong about your suspicions, Jessica told audiences, but it's better to report and be wrong than to stay silent and allow abuse to continue. Reporting doesn't mean the elderly person will be taken from their home or lose their independence. It means trained professionals will investigate, assess the situation, and provide support if abuse is occurring. 5 years after Jessica had intervened in Margaret Henderson's attempted withdrawal, she reflected on how that single transaction had transformed her understanding of her role as a banking professional. She'd processed hundreds of thousands of transactions over 13 years at Wells Fargo: deposits, withdrawals, transfers, loan payments. Most were routine and unremarkable, but scattered among those hundreds of thousands of transactions were moments where observation and intervention could prevent exploitation, protect vulnerable customers, and potentially save lives. Margaret Henderson had been one of those moments. The elderly woman attempting to withdraw $20,000 in cash with shaking hands and visible fear could have been just another transaction. Jessica could have processed the withdrawal without questions, and Margaret would have handed her life savings to her abusive grandson, leaving herself destitute and still vulnerable to future exploitation. But Jessica had noticed the warning signs, had asked questions, had reported concerns, and had ultimately helped protect Margaret from devastating financial and physical abuse. Jessica maintained contact with Margaret over the 5 years following Tyler's conviction and imprisonment. They met occasionally for coffee, and Jessica watched Margaret rebuild her life with the security of knowing her abuser was incarcerated and couldn't harm her. Margaret had reconnected with old friends she'd drifted away from during the period when Tyler was exploiting her. She'd found a support group for elder abuse survivors where she could process her trauma with people who understood. She'd repaired some of the damage to her relationship with her daughter Linda, though their relationship remained complicated by Linda's continued ambivalence about Tyler's imprisonment. Most importantly, Margaret had regained her sense of safety and autonomy. She lived in her home without fear. She controlled her own finances without someone threatening or coercing her. She made decisions about how to spend her money based on her own needs and desires rather than on someone else's demands. She'd even found a way to help other elderly people. She volunteered with a peer support program where elder abuse survivors provided support and mentorship to newly identified victims navigating the aftermath of exploitation. "I never thought I'd be talking publicly about being abused by my grandson," Margaret told Jessica during one of their coffee meetups. "I was so ashamed. I felt like I'd failed somehow, like I should have been able to stop Tyler or protect myself. But working with other survivors has shown me that elder abuse happens to people from all backgrounds, all education levels, all economic situations. It's not the victim's fault. It's the perpetrator's choice to exploit someone they should have been protecting." Margaret explained that her volunteer work with elder abuse survivors gave her a sense of purpose and healing. "Every person I talk to who's been exploited by a family member or caregiver, I can tell them, I've been there. I know how you feel. I know the shame and the fear and the confusion about how someone you love could hurt you this way. And I can also tell them, it gets better. You can recover from this. You can feel safe again. I'm proof of that. And you're proof of that too, Jessica. You're proof that there are people who care, people who pay attention, people who will help when they see someone in trouble. Jessica felt moved by Margaret's transformation from frightened victim to empowered advocate. You've taken something terrible that happened to you and used it to help other people. That takes incredible strength. I learned that strength from you, Margaret said. When you stopped my withdrawal and asked if I was being pressured, when you didn't just accept my answer that everything was fine, when you kept asking questions until I told the truth, you showed me that my situation mattered, that I mattered, that someone cared enough to intervene. That gave me the foundation to start believing I deserved to be treated better, that I didn't have to accept being abused. Everything that's happened since Tyler's arrest, the trial, my recovery, my volunteer work, it all started with you noticing something was wrong and refusing to ignore it. 10 years after the incident with Margaret Henderson, Jessica had risen to branch manager at a different Wells Fargo location in Miami. She supervised a team of 15 employees and was responsible for all aspects of branch operations, from customer service to sales to compliance. But elder abuse prevention remained a priority in how she managed the branch. Jessica trained every new employee extensively on recognizing financial exploitation. She created a culture where employees felt empowered to delay transactions and ask questions when something seemed suspicious. She established relationships with local adult protective services and law enforcement, so her team knew exactly who to contact when concerns arose. She tracked and celebrated instances where employees identified potential exploitation, not to generate publicity, but to reinforce that this work was valued and important. Under Jessica's leadership, her branch identified and reported 12 suspected cases of elder financial exploitation over 3 years. 8 of those reports led to investigations that confirmed exploitation and resulted in interventions protecting elderly victims. 4 turned out to be legitimate transactions with explanations that allayed initial concerns, but Jessica emphasized to her team that the 4 false alarms weren't failures. They were evidence that employees were being appropriately vigilant and that the system was working as designed. We'd rather check and be wrong than ignore and allow exploitation to continue, Jessica told her team during a training session. If we delay a transaction and ask questions and it turns out everything is fine, the only harm is a brief inconvenience to the customer. But if we ignore warning signs and process an exploitative transaction, the harm to the victim can be devastating and permanent. That's the calculation we make. Better to err on the side of caution. Jessica's reputation in the banking industry grew as she became known as an expert on elder financial abuse prevention. She was invited to speak at banking conferences, to consult with other financial institutions developing their own prevention programs, to serve on advisory committees for state and federal agencies working on elder abuse issues. She provided testimony to the Florida state legislature about proposed laws strengthening protections for elderly consumers and increasing penalties for financial exploitation. Through this work, Jessica gained broader perspective on the scope of elder financial abuse as a social problem. Approximately 1 in 10 elderly Americans experienced some form of financial exploitation annually, with losses estimated at more than $36 billion per year. The actual numbers were likely much higher, because most cases went unreported. Victims didn't recognize the abuse, didn't know who to report to, were too ashamed to come forward, or feared retaliation from abusers. The problem was worsening as the population aged. The United States had approximately 55 million people over age 65, and that number was projected to reach 80 million by 2040. As the elderly population grew, so did the population of potential victims, people with accumulated wealth from careers and property, but potentially diminished capacity to protect themselves from exploitation, people living longer but potentially experiencing cognitive decline that made them more vulnerable to manipulation, people who might be isolated from family and community support systems that could help identify and prevent abuse. Addressing elder financial abuse required multifaceted approaches. Criminal prosecution of perpetrators was important but insufficient. Many cases were difficult to prosecute because victims were reluctant to testify against family members because evidence was hard to gather, because elderly victims' testimony might be challenged due to cognitive issues. Civil remedies allowing victims to recover stolen funds were valuable but often impractical because perpetrators had already spent the money and had no assets to recover. Prevention was crucial, educating elderly people about scams and exploitation tactics, teaching family members and caregivers to recognize warning signs, training professionals who interacted with elderly people to identify and report concerns, creating systems in financial institutions and other organizations to detect suspicious activity. Jessica's work focused largely on this prevention aspect, building awareness and detection systems that could stop exploitation before it caused irreversible harm. But Jessica also recognized that addressing elder abuse ultimately required addressing deeper social issues, ageism that devalued elderly people and made their exploitation seem less serious, social isolation that left elderly people vulnerable to predatory family members or strangers,
Economic inequality that left families desperate for money and willing to exploit elderly relatives, addiction and mental health problems that drove exploitative behavior, inadequate social services and support systems for both elderly people and struggling families. We can train bank employees to notice suspicious transactions, and we can prosecute people who exploit elderly relatives, Jessica said during a conference presentation. But we also need to build communities where elderly people are valued and connected, where families have economic security and don't feel desperate for money, where people with addiction or mental health problems can get help before they turn to exploiting vulnerable relatives. Elder abuse is a symptom of broader social failures, and addressing it comprehensively requires addressing those underlying issues. The presentation resonated with the audience of banking professionals, law enforcement officers, and social service providers. Several attendees approached Jessica afterward to discuss collaboration on elder abuse prevention initiatives in their communities. These conversations led to Jessica becoming involved in a national coalition of organizations working on elder abuse prevention, contributing her expertise from the financial services perspective. 15 years after Jessica had intervened to protect Margaret Henderson, the impact of that intervention continued to expand. Margaret, now 93 years old, was still living independently in her home with support services. She continued her volunteer work with elder abuse survivors, though at a reduced schedule appropriate for her age. Her grandson Tyler had been released from prison after serving 6 years, had completed addiction treatment programs, and was reportedly living in another state and maintaining distance from family members he'd previously exploited. Margaret and Tyler had no contact, and Margaret maintained a restraining order prohibiting him from approaching her. Jessica, now 48 years old, had become a regional vice president at Wells Fargo, overseeing multiple branches and developing elder abuse prevention strategies across a large geographic area. She'd trained hundreds of banking professionals on recognizing financial exploitation. She'd helped develop policies and procedures that had been implemented across Wells Fargo's nationwide network. She'd contributed to industry-wide best practices that were being adopted by banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions. But perhaps most meaningfully, Jessica had maintained her friendship with Margaret Henderson, visiting the elderly woman regularly and continuing to be inspired by her resilience and her commitment to helping other abuse survivors. During one visit to Margaret's home, the elderly woman showed Jessica a scrapbook she'd been keeping, newspaper articles about elder abuse prevention, photos from support group meetings, thank you notes from survivors Margaret had mentored, materials from presentations Jessica had given at conferences. "This is my reminder that something good came from something terrible," Margaret explained, paging through the scrapbook. "Tyler hurt me and tried to steal everything I'd saved. That was terrible, but because of you noticing and helping me, not only did I survive and recover, but hundreds of other people have been protected. Bank employees learned to watch for warning signs. Elderly people learned about their rights and resources. Abusers learned there are consequences for exploitation. All of that happened because you paid attention to one frightened old woman in a bank 15 years ago." Jessica looked through the scrapbook, seeing the accumulated evidence of how widely the ripples from that single intervention had spread. "I was just doing my job," Jessica said. "I'd been trained to recognize warning signs of elder abuse. You showed every warning sign. I just followed my training and my instincts." "But how many bank employees have the same training and still don't act?" Margaret asked. "How many people see someone in distress and look away because it's not their problem? How many professionals who could intervene choose not to because it's complicated or uncomfortable? You didn't do that. You noticed. You cared. You acted. That made all the difference." Margaret closed the scrapbook and looked at Jessica with eyes that were now roomy with age but still sharp with intelligence and gratitude. "I have a few more years left, maybe more if I'm lucky. Every day of those years is a gift that I have because you helped me. Every person I've mentored through their recovery from abuse exists because you protected me. Every bank employee who's learned from your training and saved another elderly person exists in that chain because you started it by noticing me. That's a legacy, Jessica. That's a life well lived. Not because you did something dramatic or heroic, but because you paid attention when it mattered, and you chose to help when you could have looked away." Jessica felt tears in her eyes. She'd never thought of herself as someone who changed lives or created legacies. She'd just been a bank teller processing a transaction, someone who'd noticed warning signs and followed protocols. But Margaret was right. That simple act of noticing and acting had created ripples that spread across 15 years and touched hundreds of lives. Bank employees trained because of Jessica's case had protected their own elderly customers. Margaret had helped dozens of abuse survivors recover and rebuild. Laws and policies had been strengthened because of awareness raised by cases like Margaret's.
"Thank you for letting me be part of your story," Jessica said to Margaret. "Thank you for trusting me that day when you were so frightened. Thank you for having the courage to tell the truth about what Tyler was doing to you. Thank you for testifying even though it was hard. Thank you for turning your trauma into advocacy that helps other people. You've taught me so much about resilience and about how people can transform suffering into purpose." Margaret reached over and took Jessica's hand. "We helped each other. You saved me from losing everything and probably from being hurt worse by Tyler. I showed you that your work matters beyond just processing transactions, that paying attention to people can literally save lives. We're both better people because our paths crossed that day. That's what life is, moments where people help each other, where small acts of caring create ripples that spread farther than we can imagine." They sat together in Margaret's living room, holding hands, two women whose lives had been forever changed by a transaction that almost happened but didn't, by warning signs that were noticed instead of ignored, by questions that were asked instead of avoided, by caring that was acted upon instead of dismissed. Jessica would continue her work at Wells Fargo, training employees and developing systems to protect vulnerable customers. Margaret would continue her volunteer work until her health no longer permitted it. Both would carry forward the lessons of that day 15 years ago, that observation mattered, that caring mattered, that asking questions mattered, that one person noticing another person's distress and choosing to help could create ripples that spread across years and generations. One bank teller, one elderly woman, one attempted withdrawal that was stopped. 15 years of ripples spreading outward, protecting vulnerable people, changing systems, saving lives. That was enough, more than enough. Everything.
Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.